evening to everyone. Welcome to this exciting book launch. I'm Professor San Lim. I'm the Head of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences at SUTD. So as head of HAS, it's always very exciting for me to see my faculty, my colleagues cross significant research milestones. And certainly Nina's publication of her book is exactly one of these critical milestones in her career. And today we will be hearing more about her latest book, which is entitled Shaping the Futures of Work. And this obviously is a topic that's of great interest, especially for people like me who have to manage millennials in the workplace. And I'm sure Nina will have very interesting insights to share. But importantly, I would also like to introduce our expert discussant, Professor Xiang Biao, because he will be providing some very interesting, interesting reading of Nina's book. And just to share with you Professor Xiang's background. So he studied sociology at Beijing University, China, and received his PhD in social anthropology from the University of Oxford in the UK. And he's been working at Oxford since 2004. He is the winner of the 2008 Anthony Leeds Prize for his book, Global Body Shopping, and the 2012 William L. Holland Prize for his article, Predatory Princess. His 2000 Chinese book, 跨越边界的社区, published in English as Transcending Boundaries, was reprinted in 2018 as a contemporary classic. His work has been translated into Japanese, French, Korean, Spanish, and Italian. And since September 2021, Professor Xiang has been heading the department's Anthropology of Economic Experimentation at the Max Planck Institute for Ethnological Research. So we'll be really looking forward to hearing his views on Nina's book, but also definitely it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Nilanjan Raghunath, our dear colleague at HAS. She is Assistant Professor of Sociology, and she studies the intersection between automation and careers of millennials and the impact of technology on building status, reputation, and trust. She has several publications in leading sociology journals on the topic of social mobility of white-collar workers. And her most recent book, Shaping the Futures of Work, will be what she's sharing with us today. It was just published with McGill Queens University Press. So without further ado, let me invite Nina, and congratulations again, Nina, on the publication of this book.
Thank you, Sansan. Dear all, welcome to my book launch. I'm very excited to have all of you here to really talk about my very, very pet project, the future of work for millennials. And I want to thank Biao, especially for making it today to be my expert discussant. I really value his work. His 2006 book on global body shopping really inspired me over the years to think about the links between the local and the global. Thank you, Biao. I'm interested in the intersectionality of automation and social mobility of educated professionals and the impact of automation on status, reputation, and trust. The future of work presents very non-linear and complex relationships between firms, employees, and governments who are all anxious to get ahead and thrive in disruptions. In this book, I particularly ask very sociological questions. I move away, but definitely include some of the very significant economic debates of our time from scholars like Frey and Osborne, and David Otter from Oxford and MIT, respectively. There are, of course, many, many others who do study the future of work and really talk about the various pros and cons of including a lot of technology in our lives, particularly with things like machine learning and algorithms driving our everyday lives. People definitely worry about what's going to happen. So I wanted to look at the future of work from a very integrated manner, not just looking at which jobs are going to be outdated, because I think there are many experts in the world already looking at that, but rather I wanted to look at how collaboration can shape better futures of work. So here I'm moving to a less economic deterministic view and more to a social constructionist view of the future of work, because I do believe that collaborations between different stakeholders will really matter and shape the future of work better for all of us. Excuse me, my slides. Okay, so I went to a lot of conferences around the world, particularly in the United States. The relevance of these conferences, of course, were very huge to shaping some of the research questions I had for this book. I want to talk about one particular conference, which I went to at Wharton, whereby the business school at Wharton had a public policy initiative talk where I went to talk about something sort of related to this. I wanted to talk about migration of white-collar professionals and how high-level firms are actually handling this. And here, I think I got a lot of expert feedback. And I could also see that definitely many academics and firms were very concerned about where the future of work was heading. I'll give you one example. When I went to the Institute of Employment and Work at the Sloan School at MIT, one of the significant questions they were asking was, what kind of jobs are going to be outdated? Will, for example, jobs such as lawyers, is it going to be completely taken over by algorithms? So there's definitely a lot of concern in terms of which jobs are going to go. And then, of course, I also took courses. So here's a picture of a course I took on building and leading sustainable innovation in organizations. I took that course at MIT. I took it with other millennials and some older workers as well, because I really wanted to see how millennials are reacting to some of these courses, lifelong learning, etc. The other thing that I want to talk about is my connection with millennials. I believe that I have taught several thousand by now, and that includes my time here at SUTD and previously in other institutions. Furthermore, I've also interacted with millennials in various capacities, as entrepreneurs and so on. Now, who are millennials and why are they interesting? Millennials are born between 1980 and sometime around the fall of the Berlin Wall. I use Howe and Strauss's definition here, but many scholars vary, slightly vary in terms of the dates in which millennials are born. Why are they interesting? Because they are digital natives, more educated than ever. And so I wanted to understand their career chances and anxieties to succeed. For example, in the literature, you can see there's definitely a lot of concern about older workers being outdated, especially lesser educated older workers. I actually wanted to turn that argument on its head and say, wait a minute, just because someone is very tech savvy or say very highly educated, does that actually spare them from the disruptions that we see in the workplace? So millennials are also very much talked about in the corporate literature as the most innovative generation, but very hard to manage. So there are hundreds and hundreds of reports on this. If you just Google it, everyone from Deloitte to PwC, everyone's talking about them. And now they go on to talk about Generation Z as well. So they're really stereotyped as difficult, kind of idiosyncratic, very self-entitled. So again, I wanted to sort of test out some of these stereotypes. And of course, my interviews, I interviewed many millennials from different walks of life, but everyone was a degree holder. That was my condition for the interviews, because I was, of course, looking at people with a tertiary degree. And I looked at varied degrees from arts and social sciences to engineering and STEM. And some were about to graduate students, some were entrepreneurs already in the game for a while. The others were working in tech firms, others, in startups. So I had a wide range. And also, I had both, of course, men and women in the sample, because I really wanted to understand their narratives. So this book really looks at their narratives in comparison to huge amounts of literature that I looked at from corporations and how they talk about millennials. I want to talk about another motivational factor for this book. It's my visit to tech firms. I visited several tech firms over the years for several reasons. One reason is to look at how they do their hiring pitch. So I've been to a lot of hiring and networking events in all the big tech firms. And of course, I went for other networking events. Sometimes I took my students to interact with managers in these tech firms because I wanted them to experience what it was really like. So tech firms, why are they important and why do I look at them? Tech firms often lead the way to major organizational change. And we all know that the big tech firms, the Googles and so have you, in a sense, they are leading changes in culture and in business models. Now, one thing that I noted from the literature is that there is no longer a social contract for lifelong employment. I think lifelong employment is a myth because both employers and employees often feel stagnation and they want change. Tech firms are, of course, campuses of innovation set up to collaborate, but we need to understand their changing business culture. So what is that? Most tech firms want innovative and entrepreneurial employees right from the start. So while they are training people and giving them all kinds of extra skills that probably, post-university, they still expect these people to be ready from the get-go because obviously, they don't want to waste time or money. The office spaces in a lot of these firms, as you might know, also are very entertaining and they do support hybrid work models. These firms are what Catherine Turkle calls the conversational firm. They're exciting to join. There's free food, open plan offices, playfulness, and most of all, the promise of a flat hierarchy. The fact that your boss doesn't have an office and you can actually interact with anyone basically promises them that this is a flat structure and what Turkle calls a conversational firm. And there are also many ways of feedback. Millennials, of course, are very excited at the thought that they can actually express their views. But there are concerns of this kind of model. While it does seem attractive for some were quite, I would say, like a bit scared about what this might do to their work-life balance. Because if Google gives you, from breakfast to a massage to dinner, basically you're committed like 24 hours. So of course there is the work-life balance issue, but they also were concerned about other things like they always have to work in a group. Individual preferences are really taken over by which team you're a part of and how well you work with those teams. I remember one director that I interviewed of a big software firm. He basically said that's what they look for. They look for how good a team player you are, and if people don't get along with others, then of course they're not going to last. But there is high pressure to generate ideas, and I think some of my interviewees told me that they particularly don't like that because all this playfulness also is kind of like a setup for extremely hard work. The other thing that some of my interviewees told me is they wanted recognition early. And this is actually probably a good thing and also one of the challenges that millennials face. When they enter the workforce, within a year, they want to be noticed, they want to be recognized, they want to be promoted. And sometimes, in a big organization, that doesn't happen. So there were several cases where they jumped between a multinational firm and an entrepreneurial venture literally 4 to 5 times. So in other words, they just wanted a place whereby the concern was, of course, how can I make money? How can I make it fast? And of course, the culture of the company was important. And of course, their access to holidays, learning, and also promotion. So these were some of the main concerns. But an interesting I noticed is very few actually bothered to research the culture of the company beforehand. Rather, they relied on their networks. So they rely on alumni and other people in their network to tell them. So it's really what Mark Granovetter, when he talked about the strength of weak ties, I think that still plays a very big role in how millennials find information. Some, of course, will actually go and actually bother to look at the company website and find out more. But by and large, they rely on their networks to tell them where to work. Sometimes they end up in their dream company and they don't end up liking it. So you can see it's kind of like both companies and millennials sometimes get tired of each other. Sometimes they want to do other things. So you can see the employee turnover in a lot of these big firms is high. Until and unless they can actually rein in younger people to do very interesting things, because there's a question of, I don't want to get so bored so fast. I want to talk a little bit about the organization of my book. The future of work is a very big jigsaw puzzle, and the organization of my book pieces that together. The chapters show that the debate is very current, all the more now in the pandemic, when some millennials have actually found it hard to find jobs and keep them. So the assumption that educated millennials are safe in a rather disruptive work environment, or even a disruptive economy for that matter, is really a myth. And I'm trying to break the rhetoric of the idea that younger educated generations are generally safer. I mean, they're probably safer in the short term, but not so in the long term because of how much learning they need to do and the learning curve. And of course, the changes in business models that I talked about earlier. Almost all my interviewees took coding classes. And I thought that was an interesting thing about their views about skills upgrading. This includes those graduating from arts and social sciences degrees and who've been in the workplace for a couple of years. I interviewed both early and late millennials and some at the borderline of Gen Z, because these people are the largest numbers in the workplace right now in most parts of the world. And and I noticed that the enticement to learn coding was very, very high, because somehow they felt, coding might help them reskill and somehow be, they can find a place in a very fast changing world of work. I go on to theorize something that I call the flux society, because I'm trying to create a model which really sort of makes sense to what's happening in our current times. This was inspired by the sociologist Ulrich Beck's work. Our current understanding of risk, theorized by Ulrich Beck, Anthony Giddens, and many of their time, is useful, but I feel it's somewhat limited. They theorize risk as markets, political uncertainty, wars, etc. We of course see that even today with what's happening around the world. But I believe a theory of flux perhaps needs to be more inclusive in terms of mapping out some of the issues that we're facing in terms of unprecedented automation. For example, the inclusion of unprecedented anxiety about work, about savings, about being employable, I think is increasing. I think across the board. I mean, you can take like early millennials to late millennials. I mean, you can see that. And of course, this is also characterized by unprecedented innovation. We know that. I mean, innovation is happening in leaps and bounds. It's obviously not linear. It's exponential. And of course, this comes with a lot of corporate restructuring, because corporations have to, make a profit, obviously. So in order for them to stay relevant, they're changing their models. And the underlying factor about all this is, of course, the algorithm economy and how risk-taking has become both local and global. Risk is also celebrated, but we also fear risk. So the flux society is really where, we want to take risks. People want to become entrepreneurs. They want to become rich. They want to do all those things. they want to be relevant, but at the same time, risk is also very scary in the situation because I don't think there are enough avenues for people to actually fail. So I argue that one of the things we need to learn in this flux-driven society is, be able to fail and be able to reinvent ourselves. So one of the things I discuss later on in the book is I talk about proactive governance. You can see that that's in the title. And I go to Mariana Mazzucato from UCL. I go to her work on why governments need to be tech savvy and anticipatory of innovation in this highly disruptive world. And in a sense, I take that argument further and say, yes, governments need to be catalysts. They need to provide opportunities. For example, retraining. So the book provides a case study of Singapore, whereby I look at some of how Singapore is locally handling some of these very global challenges of automation. So I look at endeavors like Skills Future, Smart Nation, etc. And I say that they're very proactive local responses of staying competitive and relevant in a world where, flux is definitely the new normal, so that people can thrive in this uncertainty. I think millennials do have numerous opportunities here to train and retrain. But of course, one of the things I feel is, we probably need to prepare themselves and probably even us for more sort of risky futures. And also because they need to also think about, understanding diversity in skills, diversity in voices. So I guess diversity and inclusion is probably going to be a challenge that's going to come up, and it's something that I think we'll have to deal with, within Singapore society. Here I talk about I created a diagram whereby I'm trying to create like an ideal type. I use Max Weber's idea here to kind of look at what companies want. What do they actually want? So, and so if you look at this, we can think about how retraining skills, shouldn't just be a rhetoric. They should really address some of these issues that companies are looking for. So clearly they're looking for independent learners who are risk takers, and also for those who are prepared to fail. But in the second thing, I feel that companies really lack in terms of allowing their new recruits or even their mid-level managers to actually fail and reinvent, because you always have evaluations from managers, and oftentimes, so you'll find that it's in the company culture, they're talking about it, but they don't have the infrastructure, to let people fail and kind of reinvent themselves in the process. But of course, retraining comes up a lot. Every company wants their people to retrain, and of course, reinvent ourselves. So some of the ideal types that you see here, they're looking for employees who are obviously willing to collaborate, definitely for global exposure. You can see that some of these are probably life skills, right? They're not exactly a skill or like, learning coding or something like that. They want employees that have face-to-face, good at face-to-face interaction, because, they are so digitalized in that sense. And of course, they want employees who verify reliable information, who build digital capital, and of course, reputation capital. And also people who are willing to be co-workers with the team, flexibility in their jobs, willingness to be a constant learner, and of course, knowing that skills are short-lived. And so you can see that it's actually the demands are quite a bit in terms of what companies were looking for. So I go on to provide a lot of different millennial stories that I interviewed, and also all the company visits that I made to talk about a lot of these issues. And I place this in terms of Singapore's case study to sort of retrain. And so those of you who are entitled to, please use your Skills Future credits. I haven't used mine yet, but I think I will soon. I just want to talk about, lastly, the relevance of my book. Since I published this book, a lot of reports have been coming up in PwC, World Economic Forum. People are talking about Singapore's preparedness for the future of work, and all these things that of course I sociologically discuss in the book. So in the conclusion, I really urge scholars, of course policymakers, to look at the future of work very holistically, because there are so many factors in this, like for example, including an aging population, healthcare, etc., that I outline in my book. I hope that I have enticed you enough to read this book so that we can have a more detailed discussion of my findings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nina. I thought that was really fascinating, and I love the different models that you presented. Especially, I was struck by how you had a model including your willingness to co-work with technology that indeed is something that is increasingly sought by many organizations. So without further ado, let me invite Professor Xiang to weigh in on Nina's book. Professor Xiang, please.
Thank you very much. I must admit that I'm not an expert at all in this field regarding work or future. But as a layperson with a great interest in Nina's book, so I may just raise some questions. I really want to hear Nina's feedback as well as responses from the audience. And definitely this topic in general and Nina's book in particular worth serious discussion because it's such a timely and important issue. As Nina just summarized, I was particularly struck by two contradictions that she mentioned. Number one, we have the contradiction regarding the role of workers. On one hand, it become more individualistic and also become more a holy person, right? So you are not just a manufacturing workers, you go there to exercise your creativity, communicative skills, you make friends, you are supposed to explore and being very innovative and etc. On the other hand, as reported in this book and also reported across the public media, young people feel increasing crushing pressure. It cannot be fully described as alienation, as Karl Marx described in the case of many workers in the 19th century. I mean, this itself is an interesting question for me. I mean, if it's not alienation, what is it? But people do talk about it as the pressure is very high, difficult to handle, and many people therefore opt to so-called the Great Resignation, which happened in the US and also happened in countries like China, called lying flat or just quit. I mean, in Japan, it has been for a while already. Why is it so? Why is it a working environment that is supposed to be so fun, creative, exciting, at the same time force young people to resign? Second contradiction, again, as Nina put it so nicely in her presentation just now, is about related to the meaning of innovation. And she said, we are facing unprecedented level of anxieties, as she just mentioned, the workers' anxiety about savings, about how to stability and security. At the same time, we are facing unprecedented energy and the speed of innovation. So a layperson's very naive question, if innovation creates so much pressure, what is the point of this innovation? I mean, so there is a serious question, what's the definition of innovation? If you look at the finance sector, one of the most innovative sector in the entire economy worldwide since the late 1990s, started in the US, but spread across the world. All these financial, fintech and all the products, they are toxic innovations. First of all, they innovate for the sake of innovation. Secondly, there's a very real consequence of innovation. Create a huge amount of artificial paper value divorced from real economy, and put a large section of a population under stress, not as employees. Of course, you know in the US, all this mortgage subprime crisis, people become homeless. And then in the finance sector, in the banks, we know how hard the highly educated, very savvy young people working, and how much pressure they are under. They are forced to innovate, come up with all these kind of new packages, make the finance system extremely complicated. So that is another interesting thing, you know, because you are not supposed to comment on finance anymore, any social scientist, because you don't know. It is too complicated, too sophisticated. You know, any critical comments can be easily rejected, or you don't know. You know, we have so much people that graduated from this and that university working very hard to create those schemes. So that is the contradiction. So now comes to the question of work, the future of work. As Nina mentioned, the anxiety and the sense of risk is very much about a perception of future, right? As Nina again cited in the book very pertinently. I mean, Giddens said, why do we feel there's so many risks? Because we constantly look into the future. If we don't look at the future, we won't be so anxious. But we must remember, the work we're talking about is a very particular type of human activities which existed in a relatively short period of time. By work, we basically by wage labor. We go to a company to receive wage for our activity, labor activities. And until 19th century, the majority of people do not exercise their physical energy in this way. They do not live their livelihood through the form, what we call as work, as employment. But the work became very important, of course. It's not only for the capitalist economy, and it became a foundational pillar of a nation state. So you have a worker-citizen package, right? And you as an individual have your social standing, you have a basic recognition by being an employee somewhere. And also you are deserving citizens because you contribute your labor force to the nation state through economic institutions, being a company or being a public institution, etc. That is relatively new. So whether or not we can, in order to look at the future, maybe we can also look back at history and how human beings have organized, exercised their creativity, their collaboration through the most part of human history, and to have secure their material provisions as well as materialize their social needs, meet their social needs, right? So that is, I mean, that is probably is a time to think about that, because all the technological advancement, Nina again mentioned, like algorithms and of course blockchains, network communicative technologies, which enable the sharing economy and the platform economy, can be used to create an entirely new social economic ecology. But the problem now is that these technologies are being used in a different way, which created the contradictions that I mentioned. So what is this different way? Here we have an elephant in the room, so far remains invisible. That is the capital. And I'm here probably being slightly cynical, but I must say that the large amount of innovations now being carried out just for the sake of capital to stay on in their position, for capital to compete other capital, for capital to accumulate more capital, to occupy more market. I mean, if you ask them, does this really do anything for human being, your innovation? I mean, the question is irrelevant for the corporate sector. The question is whether or not I can earn more money. I mean, if I don't keep innovating, someone else will knock me out. So this creates all the question, again, very important, as Nina mentioned, the question of failure. Now the failure and the success became completely arbitrary. If you're a serious thinker, you want to do something for human being, for the society, and you want to innovate something. Sorry, no market failure, complete loser, idiot. So what the failure is this? And of course, the system is not going to help them because you are stupid to start with. You start with, the starting point is always a market value, a realization. I mean, if you have a pitch to the venture capitalist, you have to start from there. And you see, oh, they meet a certain utility and etc. in order to justify your judgment, your assessment about the market value, right? So, and also, you know, I mean, because I have some conversations with all the young people, but of course, I mean, no comparison to Nina's systematic research. It's quite painful to see young people so well educated, which is a result of 40 years post-war development. We can afford to educate young people to this level. They go to work every day. The waste of their energy, time, passion. I mean, I always think they can do much better if we just go home and write poems and write songs instead of going to bank to create all these packages and etc. I mean, well, I mean, then it also they have various negative consequences to the society. Nina, the book also mentioned the millennials do want have what she called the intrinsic value satisfaction about the job. You know, it's just not get the pay secure, but also want the job will do something good for the society. But if you look around in the world, I mean, of course, the corporates are all talking about that. But this moral gesture is very much externalized. Because it's okay, we exploit or do whatever first. So let's earn money first. And then let's be as humanitarian as possible. We have a separate section called the humanitarian concern or public relations. But then your own core business, your relation with the employees, how much security you provide to your young employees is a different matter. So then you create a very a shallow, empty, groundless moral sentiment, which actually create lots of, I think, a social divide, because the people's moral debates is no longer based on the very concrete issue here and now, and the debate sometimes become based on the abstract imagination and the principles without the immediate bearing with the reality. And this also creates all kind of confusion, again, anxiety. And young people does not know. I mean, they're worried about how to save the planet. I mean, the climate change is the biggest thing. But then they are look around themselves. How do I have a decent life? You know, I mean, I have a dream when I was young. I wanted to be a musician. I mean, now I don't want to be a professional musician, but I want time and have the feeling to spend time on music. I mean, how can I realize that? Very concrete human pursuit, but that is now, you have no idea how you're going to do it. But then you worry, read and write a bit about the planet, the future of a planet. I mean, this again, you know, Frederick Jameson's term, it's much easier to imagine the end of humanity, the end of the human race, than imagine the end of capitalism. Because it's climb always the end, the doom, the human species is doomed. But then can we think of very concretely how we can go forward? Don't waste so much energy just to keep the system going, and do something alternative. So what is the future? I mean, I think it's the critical thinking. So the university is doing so well now there, bring the STEM, the hard science, engineering, social science, and humanity together is really important. Bring them together, and with a very concrete understanding about reality, what the technology is changing, who is really driving that, what kind of change is meaningful, and what kind of change we don't know, and what kind of change is obviously just to maintain the system going, and then have some normative critique. That normative critique is extremely important. I mean, Singapore is almost my second home, but sometimes you also feel it's also there's a question. I mean, given Singapore's productivity and the material well-being level, and why shouldn't people in Singapore spend more time to pursue what is most important for being human? Friendship, love, imagination, art, working together. And why do we have to create constantly and repeatedly create this kind of nightmare, future nightmare, to scare ourselves into actions? To whose benefit? So I think it is a critical moment. I mean, it's a good critical moment. Basically means actually survival is not a big issue, unless you define survival and must be at a certain level and etc. I don't think the young people are too interested in that. No young people want a private jets or private yachts. Taking that as an index of good life. So we need to reimagine the future. So I think it's quite important to imagine the future not as a linear continuation, as Nina mentioned, as a linear continuation with some technical modification of the status quo, which is basically dominated by capital, by big corporations. But imagine the future as something quite different, but is closer to the heart of every human being. Yeah, I was stopping here. Sorry. Yeah, deliberately I tried to be a little provocative and want to hear your feedback.
Thank you, thank you. That was very, very deep. It made me think about a lot of this as to, if I were to write a part 2 of this, I have to think about basically like, how do we, I don't think we can get rid of capitalism, but how do we kind of tame it so that it doesn't become so nightmarish, for a lot of people. But I guess my book also, it provides hope in a sense. It talks about, people actually finding their own way in this kind of situation. And I think one of the first important things here is for millennials, who are going into work, to figure out the culture of the company that they're going to. And not enough are doing that. Not enough are doing that because, there's a lot of anxiety to find your first job, and sometimes the economy doesn't work as well. So sometimes you need other options, and sometimes they just don't have that. But I believe that they're very environmentally conscious. I think all of them that I interviewed, they do have concerns for the planet. So I think, that maybe we need to drive a greener economy around the world. That might be one of the solutions to have better jobs. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Xiang and also Dr. Raghunath for setting the stage for the discussion. I think you've both raised very interesting existential questions that have really interesting policy implications, organizational implications as well. So I'm sure that our audience have very many questions to ask, given that we also have quite a number of millennials among us. So we'd be very curious to hear what the audience thinks about the kinds of observations that Nina's made in her book about the millennials' attitudes, their mindsets, the kinds of values that they take to the workplace, the kinds of beliefs and lifestyle priorities that they have set for themselves.
So, Sun, I'm not a millennial, but I wonder whether I can share.
I believe you have two at home, so you're a good expert in this regard.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I think they are on a different wavelength of frequency. Anyway, thanks so much, Nilanjan and Prof. Yang. I think it was very interesting sharing. I just, recalled an interview that I'm sure we all know about Vinod Khosla. Yeah. He started the Sun Microsystems. For those of us who use yes. Computers in the 80s and 90s would have used his machines. But anyway, when he made his billions and all that, I think they've sold the firm, and he's now looking at the future, right? I'm sure we have, some of us may have seen what he says about the future. Things like technology advancing so much. I think it points to what we heard just now. So much that it may free a lot of us from doing the daily chores and daily work in the future. You talked about lawyers, for example, or even doctors. And the thing is that AI technology may change the way in which work will be totally transformed. So in a sense, the next question is, does everybody need to go to work? I think that was the kind of thing. Or do we need to restructure the way in which work is sort of, organized? And given that there's technology, we've advanced so much, and if you look at some of these countries, you look at California, for example, if you look at the GDP of California, it's much, much bigger than, many, many other countries combined, right? So in a way, some of these advanced nations are advanced enough and generating enough wealth to actually sort of finance how people live. So I think if you hear him, he's saying that in the future, maybe a lot of people don't need to work. They can spend their time in Cancun or somewhere, enjoying their life, and then spend less time. I think that's sort of happening now with the COVID situation. A lot of us are, at least the millennials, they were actually like engaging more in this new form of work and life. So I just want to hear your thoughts. Do you see that to be something that that we can see more prevalent? I think some nations are actually talking about this, paying an income, right? Yeah. Live their lives comfortably and so on, and not worry about this day-to-day grind. But it's only possible, not in all situations, of course, but if a nation that's well advanced enough and quote-unquote wealthy enough to do this. I thought I'd just share that and get your views. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashraf. It's actually very pertinent because I think I'll write a little bit in the conclusion about the universal basic income, the idea that some nations got, I think, was it Iceland or one of these Nordic countries, had this idea. And apparently they tried an experiment and then it didn't really work out. So I'm not to say that will never work out, but it's something that Karl Marx said long ago, like, somehow capitalism is a problem, but it might eventually free us so that, we can fish in the evening and talk philosophy in the morning. So it's that idea. But I really wonder, because with the current capitalist structures that we have, we still need to pay people. We need to generate income. So as long as we have this idea that we need to generate income and people need to be paid, I guess companies will think about what are we paying them for, right? So sometimes I tell my students, I said, you better be the creator of new technology, not the one, who's going to be outdated by that new technology, because I think there will be jobs, and certainly governments will intervene because they want their populations to be employed. So I think the pace of innovation and what gets to be done where, I think governments will step in and try to sort of work that out. But there is a lot of debate as to which jobs will go away in the future. And I refer to some of the work from the Oxford Martin School, whereby they talk about, this and this job, is going to disappear. Some people say only historians will be left out because only, robots will not be able to like mimic what a historian does, or someone with more nuanced, analytical skills. But then there are other scholars that say, wait a minute, eventually the robot's going to get, smart enough to even do that. So I guess ultimately it's going to be the human intention. How much are we going to still be in control of technology? And what is happening right now is companies like Google and all the big tech firms, they seem to control much of the game as to how and where innovation is going to go. So in my book, I suggest that you do need governments who really on the ball, who know what's happening, so that at least they can, I'm not saying that they overregulate it, but I'm suggesting that at least they can create opportunities so that, certain groups don't get left behind.
Good points. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, San, I think now we can invite them.
Are there any other questions? Oh, Rema. Yes. Rema, please, why don't you just unmute yourself and ask. Yay, thanks, Rema.
Hey Nina, thank you so much. I really loved your talk. I was just wondering about cultural differences among millennials. And my students love talking about the differences between Asian values and Western values and how they see themselves as being very different from their American counterparts. And I was wondering if you found differences in work ethic or approaches to companies by tracking different groups of millennials across different cultures or geographical spaces. Was that a part of your book project at all?
Yes, a little bit. Like, for example, I interviewed a lot of Singaporean millennials. So across the board, I mean, I didn't just stick to students. I interviewed like, from people like who are high up in rank, in a company, from directors to mid-level managers to students and all of them. And of course, I did speak to a lot of American millennials, and I've looked at a lot of studies on American millennials. And I think there is some little bit of difference, definitely. One thing is that I talked to a lot of American millennials, mostly at universities when I went, and for them, home ownership seems to be a major issue. And in Singapore, I don't think that's an issue because of the policies here, with public housing and all of that. So, their home ownership, savings, a lot of millennials are having to still live with their parents, which is very unusual, in the US. So there's a lot of talk about that. Even in the institute, the Institute of Work and Employment at MIT, there's a lot of discussion about this, about why the affordability of an educated millennial is going down compared to their parents. Here, I mean, I did this study, and then I think there are other studies about this as well. It's not the issue so much here, but I think I found what he was here was I think the anxiety, to succeed and sort of handle the competition. I got that a lot from all the interviewees about they always feeling a sense of, am I good enough? What do I need to do more? So I guess to an extent, they are being quite instrumental, but I think it's also a big source of worry, like, what do I do next? What do I do next? And question of, they kept shifting a lot. Like I said, many were shifting jobs and entrepreneurship, they like anything. And I'm like, I asked one of them, I said, why are you doing this? But he said, well, I might make a lot of money if I become an entrepreneur. But I said, you don't really have experience. You just about worked for 2 years. He says, does experience really matter? So in a sense, sometimes, there's a sense that, oh, my ideas matter more than my experience. So I get some of that. So yes, there are cultural differences. And just a caveat that I was talking to people with degrees. So, because I wanted to limit my sample to that, because that's the group of people I was interested in. But I mean, if you talk to millennials, who don't have tertiary degrees or who have, different kind of education, I think the concerns will be different, to be honest.
Sure. That's so interesting. Thank you, Nina. I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I think I can take one more.
Thank you, Nina.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi,
Thank you so much for your talk. May I ask about the anxieties that the millennials had for those that either experienced or had friends that experienced a digital divide or had a lack of access to the latest technologies to forward their careers? Thank you.
Thanks for that question. I didn't see a digital divide because, these were people who had college degrees, so somehow, they managed to get jobs and so afford whatever technology they needed. So that wasn't the issue. But I am sure there are other millennials who do face that. Probably less so in Singapore, but I'm sure it is there, but it's probably less so here. But I think where I found the divide was in terms of their aspirations to do things. Some basically, found certain like corporate work life way too stressful. So they wanted to make a change and do something completely different. Some were like, okay, I'm going head on, I'm going to do this. But I think I would say a wow factor that I found in millennials here in comparison is that everyone had some kind of a stopgap option, which I thought was very interesting. Like for example, if they weren't getting the job they wanted or something, they would quite okay to do something in between to tide it over. Like sometimes they might just go and be an RA in some university for a year till things improve, or do something else. So there is that sense of adaptability, I think, in Singapore millennials that I haven't really, with all the research I've done, I haven't seen that, because I'm not talking about, college students, who just take part-time jobs. I think that happens everywhere in the world. I'm talking about people who already have a degree and who are like willing to do things either to learn something or till they find their dream job. Like I had one example of a person who had a degree in linguistics, and she was looking for a really good opportunity in her area, but in the meantime, she went off and did some kind of research work for a while just to sort of tide her over. But there is some concern about what their parents think. I think, okay, come on, it's Asia, so there is a little bit of that. But I think by and large, I think the anxieties are mainly about how am I going to make it? Am I competitive enough? How am I going to afford, like life is getting very expensive, this kind of things. And other anxieties about staying relevant. Thank you.
Oh, Ellen, would you like to ask the question?
Yeah, thanks so much, Nina. Really, congratulations on the book and this fantastic talk and so many provocations. I think so. I'm a historian of science and technology, so I felt like I needed to respond to maybe being the only group that might not be replaced by robots in this provocation. And I wanted to bring the conversation back to the assumptions about technological determinism, because I really, in your presentation and also in the discussion that followed, and maybe in the way that we talk about the future, really have that sense of how do maybe especially we as educators who work explicitly at that boundary between disciplines, both talk about how to shape technologies towards more equitable and sustainable ends, which is something I work on as a practitioner, but then also give human agency into that conversation of not falling into that pattern of the race after technology and forgetting kind of the social construction that goes into those systems. So I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit more about your work, both in research and teaching in that space, because I know you have a lot of expertise in shaping the way that we also think about relationships to technology.
That's a good question, Ellen, because yes, the debates are very technologically deterministic because, because a lot of economists, of course, they're concerned about, things that are going to be outdated and things like that. So that kind of falls into that area. But I think I definitely agree that a social constructionist view is very, very important. And that's why I think in the book, I advocate collaboration like anything. And it's because I think that's very important. And I believe that stakeholders need to take ownership. And here, this is where, I talk about why, millennials need to, for example, I say like, they need to research the companies that they're going to work for, because that's one of the first steps of how you take ownership, right? You need to know like what it is that you're getting into, like what is the culture? Do you even want to work there, et cetera, et cetera. But sometimes I feel they feel that they don't really have a choice because, the markets also play a role in terms of when you're, out of college, you're trying to get your first job. Sometimes you just take what you get. And sometimes, you might wait. But I see millennials taking agency a lot through entrepreneurial ventures. This is where I've seen the most amount of agency coming up. And I think I really laud, people who are really so young, willing to actually take that risk and not go into a conventional job and say, I'm going to be part of a startup team, because that's where I can shape, my future. So, and I believe that entrepreneurship is hard. I mean, a lot of startups fail. We know that, so a few come up, but I definitely see that the willingness to jump in and take that risk. What I say is, if, people do fail, we all do fail. And I wonder if society, corporations, whatever, schools are ready to give them that second chance, because of, because I'm talking about we all need to learn to fail and reinvent. So that's the basis of, what I'm saying in that book. So I believe that we need more scope for, collaborating and talking about this. And of course, to reinvent ourselves, like, someone wants to do something completely different. Ideally, they should be able to, but, how does that happen? I think in different cultures really varies on what kind of opportunities are available. Because even, just because, we're credentially armed, I believe that doesn't really guarantee a lot anymore. I think it can guarantee your initial entry into a job, but it doesn't completely sort of shield you from sort of the various ways in which, businesses kind of self-disrupt themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina, and thank you to our audience, and of course our expert discussant, Professor Xiang. I do think that the mark of a good book is one that raises as many questions as it answers. So looking at the vibrant discussion that we've had today, as well as the different provocations that you've posed for us, I think, Nina, you've given us a lot of food for thought, for reflection as we go into the weekend. And maybe we can retaliate a little bit by lying flat over the weekend and mulling over the Great Resignation. But I do feel that you've definitely helped us to look at millennials in a different way. And so please, can I invite the audience to join me in, again, giving Nina a big round of applause and congratulating her on the completion of this fantastic book.
Thank you all. Thank you, San. Thank you, Biao.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice weekend.
Have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Have a nice weekend, everybody. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.